One of the most difficult things to do in short-term solution-focused counseling is setting proper goals. Counselees come to us with a legion of problems, all vying for our attention. It's quite a challenge for us to separate, though, all of the issues, define the problem, and then collaborate with a confused counselee on setting a counseling goal and determining the best course of action. Now, in my experience, most counselors have a desire to connect with their counselees, and what ends up happening, though, is that the counselee will feel loved and heard, but not really helped. I want you to envision this metaphor that might be helpful to you. It's like we are Moses and our counselees are the children of Israel. Things have gotten so bad in Egypt that they call out to God for deliverance. Now, God sends us, His reluctant servants, to help them. We take them by the hand and help them cross the Red Sea to escape whatever immediate trouble they're in. But then the real work of counseling begins. But during that process of once we get back on dry land, we become so focused on the counselees that we end up wandering in the wilderness instead of helping them envision what life in the promised land would be like. We know what God offers, but we are too scared to share it with our counselees. As such, we don't help them set proper goals. Now, this means that we contribute greatly to their wilderness wanderings. Well, how are we to overcome our fear of the promised land? First, we have to understand that the send me back to Egypt mindset occurs in most of our counselees. And second, we have to develop the proper mindset ourselves for helping them go to where God wants them to be. We need to engage them as Jesus engaged people. And we also need to help them set a proper course through the wilderness and to the Jordan River. In this talk, we're going to take a look then at the mindset of the counselee, the mindset of the counselor, as well as how we go about setting counseling goals. Let's start with the mindset of the counselee. Counselees come to us through different routes, but all of them go through a similar process to arrive at your office. Now, we've talked about how counseling is positional. If you'll remember that from a prior talk, we have attenders who are there because they have to be there. We have complainers who are there because there's a problem, but it's somebody else's problem. And then we have customers, those that realize they've contributed to the problem and they want help in solving it. Well, regardless of the position of the counselee, all of them have gone through a cycle or a phase of stages or steps to bring them into your office. And it's helpful to understand that because it will help you realize more of their backstory and how they got to your office, which helps you figure out where we're trying to take them. And I want you to think of it in this way. These stages of readiness. There's this pre-contemplation stage, in which the counselee isn't aware of a problem. They're pretty much resistant to any idea of a need to go to counseling. In other words, to them there is no problem, and that's where things begin. But then they move into what's called the contemplation phase. And in the contemplation phase, something kind of occurs to them. They're still ambivalent about counseling, but they feel torn about this. They think to themselves, well, there might be a problem. Something's not quite adding up. There might be a problem. And then that leads them to the preparation phase. And in the preparation phase, the counselee's thinking, yeah, I got to do something about this problem. So they've gone from this total lack of awareness of a problem to battling back and forth, debating whether there was a problem, to now they're saying, yeah, there's a problem, and I need to do something about it. And as they wrestle with that a little bit more, then they come to the action phase. Okay? And in the action phase, they not only decide to do something, but they initiate the counseling process. They finally say, I'm going to make that call, or I'm going to schedule that appointment. They decide that they want to do something. And that's where they enter into the counseling relationship with you. Now, the reason that's important, it's very helpful for you to understand the struggle and the nature of the problem and the nature of the relationship and history with the problem. It'll help you set goals of where we're trying to go if you can see how they got to you in the first place. And so just being aware of that. And then, of course, once they're into the action process, we kind of move on out to what we would call the maintenance process. And this is where they're consolidating gains that they've learned through the counseling process. I just want to close the loop there. We want them to be glad that they came to counseling. So, like I said, this phase is important because it helps you see that spiral or those phases people go through in order to get the courage up even to make the appointment. And so you need to be sensitive to that, aware of that it takes a lot of courage. You need to remind them of that. It takes a lot of courage to even start the counseling process. But we want to understand how they got here because it also helps us identify potential exceptions and even possible solutions to the counselee's issue that they bring to you. So when we look at that, the mindset of the counselee, we then have to look at, so that's how they were. It's been a battle to get them there in their own hearts, but they've gotten brave enough to at least get into your office. And then we need to think about how we approach them initially as counselors. So there's a mindset there of the counselor we need to kind of go over. You know, in short-term solution-focused counseling, the counselor is not a sage on the stage, but he or she is a guide by the side. As counselors, we walk alongside our counselees, helping them see what they can't see. We also have to keep two things in mind. First, we have to encourage counselees gently but persistently to take responsibility for their decisions. And second, we must clarify their willingness to get their feet wet in the Jordan River. Think about it this way. When blind Bartimaeus called out to Jesus in Mark chapter 10, Jesus asked him a specific question. Jesus heard him. Jesus said, bring him here. So they brought him here. And Jesus asked a very specific question. And it may seem obvious, but it might not have been. Jesus simply looked at Bartimaeus and he said, what do you want me to do for you? And so we hear that because we want to act in the same way. We want to help counselees solve the problems they're struggling with and not ones that we in our infinite wisdom think they're struggling with. Now, you may identify a presenting problem that's not really the problem. I understand that. That happens often. But without helping them solve the presenting problem, you'll never get to the real problem. So the idea is we simply need to have Jesus' mindset. What do you want me to do for you? Now we say that gently, of course, but I think Jesus provides a great model there. What do you do if the guy comes up to Jesus and it's not the blindness that bothers him? Maybe he's got a limp. Maybe he's got a family relationship issue. You want to start where the client is. And that's what Jesus did by opening it up and saying, what do you want me to do for you? The other thing is, we want to clarify their commitment to the process. We encourage them and we thank them for coming in and demonstrating courage for showing up. And then we want to make sure, though, that they're really ready to do some work. And when I think of that, I think of Jesus in John chapter 5 with the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. That Jesus, if you remember the story, Jesus asked that individual a question as well. He said, he looked at the man and he said, "Do you want to get well?" And I think it's kind of part of that counting the cost. We want to make sure we have buy-in and commitment. We want them to take responsibility for their own healing, and we also want them to be committed to the process, because counseling is not easy. If it were easy, you wouldn't need to have it. And so we're just trying to do that. That needs to be our mindset. But to do that, we do it in with a certain attitude or therapeutic stance. What we're wanting to do is we're wanting to continually remind them of the hope of the future. We want to engender hope. And now how can we say that? Well, the reason we want to engender hope is that we believe that God is up to something in the life of that counselee. Our sovereign God and creator of the universe is up to something. The Spirit is on the move in the life of that person, and it's our job to help them discover what that something is. So God is at work in the life of this counselee. And so one of the ways we go on a glory hunt, if you will, we want to see where God might be working. We do that, we can engender hope then by exploring what's been better. Hey, the problem's not always the same. Tell me what's different about times when the problem isn't so terrible or as bad as it normally is. We also maybe it hasn't changed that much, but maybe it's not gotten any worse. How are you managing that? What's God doing in you that gives you that resilience? What are you able to do to keep it from getting worse? We're looking for exceptions to the problem that they brought to you, but we're also looking for any hidden strengths or any resilience that they may not have identified they have. So as we gather more information, we can help then the counselee cast an alternative vision of the future. A future either without the problem, or at least a future in which the counselee has a different relationship with the problem. And this movement helps us then determine the goals of where we're trying to go. In other words, it gives us the direction of, we're in the wilderness, the Jordan and the Promised Land are this way, let's go. And so that's what we're trying to do. Now, when we talk about setting goals, you got to think about this. You can't set proper goals until you've boiled down the problem. What do I mean by boiling down the problem? Well, boiling down a problem means simplifying a complex situation to its most essential core issue or fundamental cause. It involves stripping away irrelevant details and background noise, much like evaporating water from a sauce, to focus on the single most important factor. Now, in the Bible, we see passages like 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7, which states this: "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So when we think of boiling down the problem, we're talking about testing it through fire so that we remove all of the impurities, if you will. There's many things that are competing, and it's a hodgepodge or a chaotic mess in the counselee's brain. And what we want to do is be able to boil down the essence of the problem without all of the rabbit trails. Now, we do this in gentleness, and we're very humble as we listen to them. But we see here that we got to think about the trials as a refining fire to separate impurities. In the same way, when we're working with counselees, we want to separate all those irrelevant details so that we can get down to the root of the problem. Now, this doesn't mean that it's always a sin issue, but it is almost always a chaotic issue for the counselee. What we are doing is separating the person from the problem. Think of the counselee's life as the precious metal and the problem as the dross or the dross. How can we help them pursue a life of purity if we don't separate the impurities or the problem from their lives? And so we do this by helping them boil it down. We listen carefully, and I'll give you some steps here in just a second, but the idea is there's a lot of extra stuff that encapsulates the problem usually, and they're not aware of what that extra stuff is. So we help them peel back that onion so they can really get down to the root cause of what we're dealing with, and that will allow us then to see where we're headed or what we need to fix. Now, once we boil the problem down, we can start to explore ways that the counselee can relate differently to the problem. Relating differently to the problem provides our goal or goals for counseling. And here are some basic steps we can take in goal setting then. First, we need to get them to describe the goal. In other words, once we kind of get things, we're starting to interact with them, what will change look like in general? What will be different in your life without this problem? And then we need to clarify the goal. We need to get concrete, specific, and precise on what the change will be. We need to, after clarifying what we're doing, yes, the problem is X, then we need to formulate the goal. We need to focus on what the person will be doing. So you said the problem is fear. So if I'm a fly on the wall, this would be formulating the goal. If I'm a fly on the wall and I visit your house 2 months after you're finished counseling and we've dealt with fear, what are you going to be doing that's different? Now we're focusing on doing instead of being or feeling or thinking. What are you going to be doing? We want them to start to envision what their life will be like without the problem, or at least in this case, the problem where they've related to fear in such a way where fear is not such an intrusion anymore in their lives. So we want to help them do that. So we focus on what they'll be doing once this change is accomplished. And then we scale that goal. We use scaling questions to reveal both the desired outcome and their current position in relation to that outcome. It tells us how bad the problem is. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being no fear at all and 10 being completely paralyzed by fear, where are you today? I'm an 8. Well, if this is successful when we work together, or after this is successful, and then you are doing the X, Y, and Z that we talked about, where do you think your fear level will be? Well, it'll be about a 3. Great. Our job is to work together then to see what we need to do to go from an 8 to a 3. Are you willing to go with me? That's what we're doing about formulating and scaling the problem. And then any follow-up questions can help refine the goal, refine the direction a little bit, because sometimes that's a work in progress as you all collaborate. So I just wanted you to see that when we come together with a counselee, we are already going to assume we're going to have an encouraging, hopeful outlook on things. We can be enthusiastic if it's proper, I guess, but we want to be encouraging because we know that God is at work in their life. And we know that there are some things they can take responsibility for, and if they'll commit to a process, we can help them discover ways of relating to the problem differently, which will help them improve and lessen the effect of the problem. And so once they lessen the effect, they'll feel more competent and confident, and they can move forward to glorify God by becoming the person that He wants them to be. Now, for your learning activity, as we've seen, a proper goal presupposes an accurate diagnosis of the problem. In this learning activity, you're going to draw on your personal experience to think through the steps of how to formulate and communicate a goal. I want you to pair up. Now, of course, if you're doing this on your own with the online class, you'll have to do it by yourself, as an individual exercise. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to think of a person in your life who has mentioned a problem to you recently. Now, it doesn't have to be a big problem, just some annoyance. It could be a big problem, but just think about those conversations. Now, obviously, if you've counseled before, I might say, hey, think of a current counselee that you're dealing with or a prior counselee, but many of you haven't counseled yet. So think of interactions, because people will talk to you about things they're struggling with all the time if you really pay attention. So think of a struggle someone's had, a family member, friend, where things aren't really going according to plan. Now, I want you to write these things down. So state that person's name, and then after that, I want you to answer this question. How would your friend describe the problem? Now, I want you to, as best you can recall, write it down in a sentence or two how your friend would describe the problem. Now, number 3, here's the next question I want you to write down. Because you know a little bit more about the background and context and everything of the person. How would you elaborate on their understanding of the problem? In other words, What are the deeper themes that you would suspect? Let's say a wife comes and she mentions that her husband, she's very angry because her husband he never plans anything to do anything with her. And you think, okay, so the presenting problem is kind of anger. But it sounds like the more I listen to her, that the real problem is she feels rejected and ignored by her husband, and it hurts her feelings. So she feels invalidated. So that would really be what I mean by expanding that theme out a little bit, as by putting a few pieces together of observations you've made, looking for that core issue of what's driving that anger. Because remember, anger is usually a secondary emotion that covers up fear, hurt, or frustration. So go a little deeper if you can. Now, number 4, answer this question in a sentence or two. How can you restate the problem so that your friend can say, yes, that's me? So in other words, you're not just giving what he or she said, but also you're tying in what you think the deeper implication is going to be, but you need to communicate it in a way where this person can accept that. So you're not going to say, I just think that you're a fraidy cat, or I just think that you are totally insecure and need some help. No, you do it lovingly, but you're trying to incorporate what may be the larger picture. Remember, God's at work here, and you're trying to figure out what's happening. So go to that step. How can you restate the problem so that your friend can say, yes, that's me? Because you want to include those deeper themes, those biblical life themes, if you will, but you want to do it in such a way where they don't deny that that's what it is. You won't get this right perfectly all the time, but we're working toward formulating a goal. 5th, I want you to write this down. How would your friend's life be different if the problem went away? What would they be doing if this problem that you've designed in number 4 went away? Think that through very elaborately, a sentence or two on what that would look like. And what I want you to do is I want you to write all that down, like I said, and then share with your classmate that you've paired up with. Now, if you're the classmate, I want you to listen very attentively, attentively, as Collar would say, and help your partner refine that a little bit. In other words, hey, I wonder if this, I suspect that. What do you think about this? Collaborate. And the reason I'm having you do that is when you work as a counselor in a church-based counseling ministry, there will be a lot of collaboration between counselors to help people figure things out. So that's part of what I want you to do in this exercise. So I hope that's been helpful. I look forward to kind of engaging you with that. In this lesson, you learned about the setting of goals by boiling down the problem. Now, in our next talk, we're going to begin learning how to love your counselees by providing the proper atmosphere and alignment. Well, I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. God bless. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.